The neon lights of Bangkok reflected off the rain-slicked streets, painting the city in hues of electric blues and fiery reds. Tawan Wirat, the heir to one of Bangkok's most powerful crime families, leaned against the polished hood of his luxury car, his sharp eyes scanning the bustling streets. Despite the wealth and influence that came with his family name, Tawan felt trapped, his life dictated by duty and tradition. Tonight was supposed to be another routine inspection of his family's operations, ensuring deals ran smoothly, no hiccups, no surprises. But the city had a way of defying expectations, and this night would be no different. "Let's wrap this up quickly," Tawan murmured to his consigliere, Rian, who stood at his side with a stoic expression. "I have better things to do than babysit smugglers." Just as Tawan turned to leave, chaos erupted. A deafening explosion shattered the calm, and flames engulfed a nearby warehouse. Screams filled the air as people scrambled for cover. Tawan's instincts kicked in. "Get everyone out of here," he ordered, his voice cutting through the panic. Rian nodded, barking commands into his radio. As the dust settled, a figure emerged from the shadows. Dressed in black, with a lean, muscular frame, Chaichana moved with predatory grace. He was a mercenary, infamous for his efficiency and ruthlessness. Tonight, he'd been hired to disrupt Tawan's operations, but he hadn't anticipated the heir himself being present. Day's mission was simple: plant the explosives, create chaos, and slip away unnoticed. But fate had other plans. As he darted through the alleyways, he found himself cornered by Tawan's men. Their guns trained on him, escape seemed impossible. Yet, Day stood tall, his eyes cold and defiant. Tawan approached, his curiosity piqued by the man who had single-handedly disrupted his operation. "You're either very brave or very stupid," Tawan said, his tone icy. "Who sent you?" Day smirked, the faintest glint of amusement in his eyes. "Wouldn't you like to know?" Tawan studied him for a moment before making a surprising decision. "Put the guns down," he commanded his men. "I'll handle this." The tension in the air was palpable as Tawan stepped closer to Day. "You've caused me a lot of trouble tonight. Tell me, why shouldn't I end you right here?" Day's smirk widened. "Because I'm more useful alive?" Intrigued by his audacity, Tawan made an unexpected offer. "Work for me. Prove your loyalty, and I might let you live." Day hesitated, weighing his options. His employers had left him for dead, and this new proposition offered a way out. "Fine," he said, extending his hand. "But don't expect me to play nice." Tawan's lips curved into a sly smile. "I wouldn't dream of it." Their alliance was born out of necessity, but neither man could deny the undercurrent of tension between them. As the night wore on, Tawan couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change, and not entirely for the better. Beneath the shadows, the neon lights of Bangkok reflected off the rain-slicked streets, painting the city in hues of electric blues and fiery reds. Tawan Wirat, the heir to one of Bangkok's most powerful crime families, leaned against the polished hood of his luxury car, his sharp eyes scanning the bustling streets. Despite the wealth and influence that came with his family name, Tawan felt trapped, his life dictated by duty and tradition. Tonight was supposed to be another routine inspection of his family's operations, ensuring deals ran smoothly, no hiccups, no surprises. But the city had a way of defying expectations, and this night would be no different. "Let's wrap this up quickly," Tawan murmured to his consigliere, Rian, who stood at his side with a stoic expression. "I have better things to do than babysit smugglers." Just as Tawan turned to leave, chaos erupted. A deafening explosion shattered the calm, and flames engulfed a nearby warehouse. Screams filled the air as people scrambled for cover. Tawan's instincts kicked in. "Get everyone out of here," he ordered, his voice cutting through the panic. Rian nodded, barking commands into his radio. As the dust settled, a figure emerged from the shadows. Dressed in black, with a lean, muscular frame, Chaichana moved with predatory grace. He was a mercenary, infamous for his efficiency and ruthlessness. Tonight, he'd been hired to disrupt Tawan's operations, but he hadn't anticipated the heir himself being present. Day's mission was simple: plant the explosives, create chaos, and slip away unnoticed. But fate had other plans. As he darted through the alleyways, he found himself cornered by Tawan's men. Their guns trained on him, escape seemed impossible. Yet, Day stood tall, his eyes cold and defiant. Tawan approached, his curiosity piqued by the man who had single-handedly disrupted his operation. "You're either very brave or very stupid," Tawan said, his tone icy. "Who sent you?" Day smirked, the faintest glint of amusement in his eyes. "Wouldn't you like to know?" Tawan studied him for a moment before making a surprising decision. "Put the guns down," he commanded his men. "I'll handle this." The tension in the air was palpable as Tawan stepped closer to Day. "You've caused me a lot of trouble tonight. Tell me, why shouldn't I end you right here?" Day's smirk widened. "Because I'm more useful alive?" Intrigued by his audacity, Tawan made an unexpected offer. "Work for me. Prove your loyalty, and I might let you live." Day hesitated, weighing his options. His employers had left him for dead, and this new proposition offered a way out. "Fine," he said, extending his hand. "But don't expect me to play nice." Tawan's lips curved into a sly smile. "I wouldn't dream of it." Their alliance was born out of necessity, but neither man could deny the undercurrent of tension between them. As the night wore on, Tawan couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change, and not entirely for the better. Chapter 2: Shadows of the Past. Chaichana's integration into Tawan's operations was met with mixed reactions. Rian, ever loyal and cautious, kept a close eye on the mercenary, his distrust evident in every interaction. "You're taking a risk bringing him in," Rian said as he and Tawan reviewed security footage of the disrupted warehouse. "I know a valuable asset when I see one," Tawan replied, his tone firm. "Day's skills are unmatched, and I'd rather have him working for me than against me." Rian sighed, his concern unshaken. "Just don't let your guard down. Men like him are dangerous." Meanwhile, Day observed the inner workings of Tawan's empire. From the elaborate smuggling networks to the discreet negotiations with corrupt officials, he was impressed by the operation's efficiency. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. One evening, as Day returned to his quarters, he found Tawan waiting for him. "Enjoying your new accommodations?" Tawan asked, his arms crossed. Day's gaze was steady. "It's better than a prison cell." Tawan chuckled, but his expression turned serious. "I need to know I can trust you. My family's survival depends on it." Day hesitated, the weight of his past pressing down on him. "Trust is a two-way street. You want my loyalty? Prove I'm more than just a pawn to you." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Rian burst in, his face grim. "We have a problem. The Widow's gang just hit one of our supply routes. They left a message. They're coming for you to." The Widow was a name that struck fear in the underworld. A ruthless rival with a vendetta against Tawan's family, she was known for her calculated attacks and unrelenting pursuit of power. Tawan's jaw tightened. "Gather the men. We're going to show her what happens when she crosses us." Day watched as Tawan took control, his leadership commanding and unyielding. For the first time, Day saw the man behind the name, not just a crime lord, but someone who bore the weight of an empire on his shoulders. As the night unfolded, Tawan and Day found themselves in the thick of the action. The Widow's men were skilled, but Tawan's forces held their ground. Day's expertise in combat proved invaluable, and together, they turned the tide of the battle. After the dust settled, Tawan approached Day, his expression unreadable. "You saved my life tonight," he said quietly. "Maybe you're not just a pawn after all." Day's smirk returned, though it was softer this time. "I told you, I'm more useful alive." As they stood amidst the wreckage, an unspoken understanding passed between them. Their alliance was fragile, but it was growing stronger with each passing day. Both men knew that the road ahead would be fraught with danger, but for now, they had each other. Bangkok streets had quieted in the aftermath of the Widow's assault, but the air remained heavy with tension. The damage to Tawan's empire was minimal, strategic even. The Widow's move wasn't a blind strike, it was a calculated message. She wasn't just after blood. She wanted something deeper, something Tawan hadn't yet uncovered. Tawan sat in his office, a sleek space overlooking the city's glowing skyline. Papers and maps were strewn across his desk, remnants of Rian's analysis of the widow's attack. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled his attention to the door. Day entered, his expression unreadable as always. "You've been quiet," Tawan remarked, leaning back in his chair. Day crossed his arms. "Just observing. She wasn't aiming to destroy you, not yet. This was bait." Tawan raised an eyebrow. "Go on. She's testing your response," Day continued. "Seeing how far she can push without overstepping. If you retaliate blindly, you'll play into her hands." Rian, who stood by the window, scoffed. "And what would you suggest? Sit back and wait for her to strike again?" Day's gaze flicked to Rian, calm but cutting. "Oh. You strike first, but not where she expects." Tawan considered Day's words. He had to admit, the mercenary had a knack for strategy. "Do you know her next move?" Day shook his head. "Not yet. But I know her type. She'll want to keep you guessing. We need leverage, something to make her second-guess her own plans." Before Tawan could respond, a soft chime interrupted them. His private line. Few people had access to that number. He answered, his tone sharp. "Speak." A familiar voice crackled through the line, one that made Tawan's blood run cold. "Tawan, my dear boy. It's been too long." "Mother," he said, his voice tightening. He hadn't spoken to his mother in years, not since she'd left the family and disappeared into the shadows of Europe. Her timing was no coincidence. "I hear you've been making waves," she said smoothly. "I thought I'd call before things get messy." Tawan's jaw clenched. "What do you want?" "To help," she replied. "The widow and I have history. I know her better than you do. Perhaps it's time we had a little family reunion." The line went dead before Tawan could respond. He set the phone down slowly, his mind racing. His mother's reappearance complicated everything. She was as dangerous as she was enigmatic, and her involvement rarely came without a price. Day watched Tawan closely. "Trouble?" "Family," Tawan muttered, his voice thick with disdain. "The worst kind." The following night, Tawan, Day, and Rian met in a dimly lit room beneath one of the family's safe houses. Maps and surveillance photos covered the table. Rian was in the middle of a heated explanation about the widow's suspected hideouts when the door opened, revealing a striking woman in her late 40s. Her presence commanded the room instantly. "Tawan," she said, her lips curving into a smile. "Still brooding, I see." "Mother," Tawan said, his voice void of warmth. "What do you want?" She strode to the table, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "To keep you alive, of course. The widow is playing a long game, and you're woefully unprepared." Tawan bristled. "And you think you can help?" "I know I can," she said, her tone sharp. "But you'll have to trust me." Rian looked between them, his unease clear. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice low. Day, ever perceptive, seemed to piece it together first. "Your mother," he said, addressing Tawan. "The one who vanished." "She didn't vanish," Tawan corrected, glaring at her. "She abandoned us." His mother's smile didn't waver. "Semantics, darling. Now, are you going to listen, or do you prefer watching your empire crumble?" Day smirked, clearly enjoying the exchange. "I think we should hear her out." Tawan's glare shifted to Day, but after a long pause he sighed. "Fine." She leaned over the table, her manicured nails tapping one of the maps. "The widow isn't after your territory or your money. She's after something far more personal, revenge." Tawan frowned. "Revenge for what?" "That," his mother said, her eyes glinting with a mixture of amusement and warning, "is a story for another time." As tension thickened in the room, Day couldn't help but feel he'd stepped into something far more intricate than a simple gang war. Whatever secrets lay beneath the surface, one thing was clear: the shadows surrounding Tawan's family ran deeper than he'd anticipated. Tawan's mother, Amara, had always been a force of nature, a woman who could command loyalty and fear with equal ease. Now, as she outlined her knowledge of the widow's network, Tawan found himself torn between resentment and grudging respect. Day, on the other hand, listened intently, his eyes sharp as he pieced together the web of connections. "The widow and I have history," Amara began, her voice measured. We were allies once, years ago. That changed when she blamed me for her brother's death. Tawan's brows knit together. Her brother? What does that have to do with me? Amara's expression hardened. Everything. Your father and I made choices to protect this family. Choices that created enemies. Tawan exhaled sharply, his frustration evident. And now I'm cleaning up your mess? Amara's gaze softened, but only slightly. You're strong enough to handle it. But strength alone won't save you, Ton. You need strategy and allies. Day cleared his throat, drawing their attention. And where do I fit into this? Amara studied him for a moment, her lips curving into a faint smile. You're the wild card. Someone the widow hasn't accounted for. Use that to your advantage. Later that night, Tawan found himself restless. The weight of his mother's revelations and the looming threat of the widow gnawed at him. Needing air, he slipped out of the safe house and onto the rooftop, where the city stretched before him like a living, breathing entity. He wasn't alone for long. Day appeared, moving with the quiet grace that always unnerved Tawan. Can't sleep? Day asked, leaning against the railing. Tawan didn't answer immediately. Too much on my mind. Day nodded, his gaze fixed on the skyline. Your mother's right about one thing. You need to be unpredictable. The widow won't expect you to trust someone like me. Tawan turned to him, his expression unreadable. And should I trust you? Day smirked, his dark eyes glinting with amusement. That depends. Do you think I'll betray you? Tawan's lips quirked into a faint smile. I think you'll do whatever benefits you most. Day chuckled softly, a sound that sent an unexpected shiver down Tawan's spine. You're not wrong. For a moment, the tension between them shifted, something unspoken passing in the silence. Tawan's gaze lingered on Day a second too long before he looked away. We should focus on the widow. Personal matters can wait. Day raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening. Personal matters? I didn't realize we had any. Tawan's jaw tightened, but he didn't reply. He turned and headed back inside, leaving Day on the rooftop, his expression thoughtful. The next day, Amara's plan began to take shape. They would bait the widow into revealing her next move by staging a high-profile deal, a shipment of counterfeit goods disguised as a rare artifact. It was risky, but it was the kind of move that could draw the widow out of hiding. As preparations began, Day found himself working closely with Tawan, their partnership growing more seamless with each passing hour. They anticipated each other's moves, their trust slowly building despite the walls they both kept up. One evening, after hours of planning, Tawan's guard slipped. They were in the safe house, reviewing schematics for the deal's location, when Tawan caught Day watching him. What? Tawan asked, his tone more curious than annoyed. Day shrugged, his usual smirk softened. You're different from what I expected. Tawan raised an eyebrow. And what did you expect? Someone spoiled, entitled, Day admitted. But you're driven. You carry all this weight and you don't let it crush you? Tawan hesitated, the compliment catching him off guard. You don't know me. Day's gaze didn't waver. Not yet. The words hung between them, charged with a tension that neither could deny. For a moment, Tawan allowed himself to feel the pull, the vulnerability of connection. But then, as always, duty pulled him back. Focus, Tawan said, his voice firm. We have a job to do. Day's smirk returned, but his eyes held something deeper. Whatever you say, boss. The staging of the deal was meticulous. The counterfeit artifact, a golden statuette supposedly imbued with mystical significance, was chosen specifically to attract the widow's attention. The location was an abandoned temple on the outskirts of Bangkok, a place steeped in enough lore to make the deal appear authentic. Every detail had been calculated, from the smuggling routes to the escape plans. Tawan and Day stood side by side as the final preparations were made. Despite the crisp efficiency of their team, Tawan couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. The widow wasn't one to fall for simple traps. You seem tense, Day remarked, breaking the silence. I'm always tense when dealing with people who want me dead, Tawan replied dryly. Day smirked, leaning casually against a pillar. Relax. If this goes south, I'll make sure you don't die alone. Tawan shot him a withering look, but the hint of a smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Comforting. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the temple grounds, the deal commenced. The buyers were actors hired by Tawan's mother, a group of international smugglers known for their ostentation. They played their parts convincingly, haggling and flaunting their wealth with just the right amount of arrogance. From their hidden vantage point, Tawan and Day observed the scene unfold. Day's sharp eyes scanned the surroundings, looking for any sign of the widow's interference. The tension in the air was palpable. "I don't like this," Day muttered. Before Tawan could respond, a muffled explosion echoed from the temple's east wing. Chaos erupted as smoke billowed through the air, and armed figures emerged from the shadows. "It's her," Tawan said, his jaw tightening. Day grabbed his arm. "We need to move." Now, amidst the chaos, Tawan and Day fought their way through the temple. Day's expertise in combat proved invaluable as he neutralized threats with precision. Despite the danger, Tawan found himself impressed by the mercenaries' unflinching determination. They reached the central chamber, where the widow herself awaited. She was a striking figure, her dark attire blending seamlessly with the shadows. Her eyes locked onto Tawan, a cold smile spreading across her face. "Tawan Wirat," she said, her voice smooth and menacing. "You've inherited your father's arrogance? And you've inherited your brother's grudge," Tawan shot back. Her smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of anger. "You know nothing about my brother or what your family took from me. Then enlighten me," Tawan said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. Before she could respond, Day stepped forward, his gun trained on her. "This ends here." The widow laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "You think you can end me with a bullet, mercenary? I know you're kind, loyal to no one but yourself." Day's expression didn't waver. "Try me." In the tense standoff, a voice crackled through Tawan's earpiece. It was Rian. "The reinforcements are in position. Say the word and we'll bring this place down." Tawan hesitated. The widow was within reach, but so were the answers she held. Ending her here and now would solve one problem but leave others unanswered. "Not yet," Tawan said into the earpiece. Day glanced at him, his brow furrowed. "You're letting her go?" "For now," Tawan replied, his eyes never leaving the widow's. "This isn't over." The widow smirked, clearly understanding the power play. "Wise choice. But remember, Tawan, you can't hide from the truth forever." With that, she disappeared into the shadows, her escape as seamless as her attack. Later that night, back at the safe house, Tawan sat alone in his office, his mind racing. He had spared the widow, but at what cost? The encounter had raised more questions than answers. A soft knock at the door broke his thoughts. "Come in," he called. Day entered, his usually confident demeanor softened. "You all right?" Tawan leaned back in his chair, studying the man who had risked his life alongside him. "You think I made the wrong call?" "I think you made the hard call," Day said, taking a seat across from him. "And that says a lot about you." Tawan's gaze lingered on Day, the weight of the night momentarily lifting. "You've been surprising me a lot lately." Day chuckled, a rare warmth in his voice. "I aim to keep you on your toes." For a moment, the silence between them wasn't heavy but comfortable. Tawan felt the tension in his chest ease, a rare reprieve from the constant pressure. "You should get some rest," Day said, standing. "Big day tomorrow." Tawan nodded, but as Day turned to leave, he spoke again. "Day." Day paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Yeah, thanks. For tonight." Day's lips curved into a soft smile, one that Tawan hadn't seen before. "Anytime, boss." As the door closed, Tawan exhaled, his thoughts conflicted. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure if the most dangerous threat to his carefully guarded life was outside his walls, or within. The days following the widow's attack were marked by an uneasy calm. Tawan threw himself into preparations for the next move against her, but the questions left unanswered gnawed at him. His mother's cryptic hints about the past only deepened the mystery. Day, meanwhile, had become an integral part of the operation. Though Rian remained wary of the mercenary, Tawan found himself relying on Day's insights more and more. The man had a knack for seeing patterns others missed and devising solutions that bordered on reckless brilliance. It was during one such strategy meeting, late into the night, that the lines between necessity and something deeper began to blur. The safehouse's study was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the soft glow of a table lamp. Tawan leaned over a map spread across the desk, his focus sharp as he outlined potential supply routes. Day sat across from him, his usual smirk replaced by a rare seriousness. If the widow's intel is as good as you think, she'll anticipate these routes, Day said, tapping a spot on the map. You need a decoy. Tawan frowned, his mind racing. A decoy risks exposing more of our operation. Day leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. And doing nothing risks losing everything. Sometimes you have to gamble. Tawan looked up, his gaze locking with Day's. You like taking risks, don't you? Day grinned, the playful glint returning to his eyes. Life's more interesting that way. There was a beat of silence, the weight of their unspoken tension hanging in the air. Tawan straightened, his tone softening. Why did you stay? Day blinked, caught off guard. What do you mean? You had an out the night we met, Tawan said, his voice quieter now. You could have run. Why didn't you? Day hesitated, his usual quick wit failing him. Maybe I got tired of running, he admitted, his voice low. Or maybe I just saw something worth sticking around for. The honesty in his words struck a chord in Tawan. He opened his mouth to respond, but the moment was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Rian entered, his expression grim. We have a situation, he said, breaking the charged atmosphere. The situation turned out to be a minor skirmish near one of their warehouses, a distraction, likely orchestrated by the widow. It was resolved quickly, but it served as a reminder that their enemy was always watching. That night, as the safe house settled into uneasy quiet, Tawan found himself unable to sleep. The events of the day replayed in his mind, but it was Day's words that lingered the most. He found himself wandering to the rooftop again, seeking solace in the city's restless energy. To his surprise, Day was already there, leaning against the railing with a cigarette in hand. You're up late, Tawan remarked, approaching. Day exhaled a plume of smoke, his gaze fixed on the skyline. Could say the same for you. Tawan joined him, the silence between them oddly comfortable. About what you said earlier, he began, his voice cautious. About seeing something worth sticking around for? Day glanced at him, a flicker of vulnerability crossing his features. Yeah. I don't know what you're looking for, Tawan said, his voice steady despite the unease in his chest. But if you're staying because of me, you should know, I can't promise you anything. Day turned to face him fully, his expression unreadable. I'm not asking for promises, Tun. I'm just saying I'm here. For now. Tawan studied him, the weight of those words sinking in. For now, he echoed, his voice softer. For a brief moment, the world seemed to fade away. The city below, the war with the widow, even the burdens they both carried, it all felt distant. Tawan found himself leaning closer, drawn to something he couldn't quite name. But before he could cross the fragile line between them, Day spoke again, his voice low but steady. We should get some sleep. Big day tomorrow. Tawan nodded, stepping back. You're right. As they descended the stairs together, Tawan couldn't help but wonder if he had just avoided a mistake, or missed an opportunity. The next morning brought with it the weight of unfinished plans and lingering tension. Tawan buried himself in preparations for their counterstrike against the widow. Every detail was scrutinized: routes, timing, personnel. Day, as always, was by his side, offering sharp insights and pointed critiques. But the air between them had changed. It wasn't overt, but in the fleeting glances, in the way their conversations lingered just a little longer, something unspoken simmered beneath the surface. By midday, they were ready to set the plan in motion. Tawan and his team would lay a false trail, baiting the widow into thinking they were smuggling a priceless artifact through one of the more obvious routes. In truth, it was a diversion, one that would buy them enough time to dismantle her supply chain elsewhere. You're leading the decoy team, Tawan told Day as they finalized assignments. Day arched an eyebrow. You're trusting me to be the bait? You're the best chance we have of making it convincing, Tawan said evenly. Can you handle it? Day smirked. You're starting to sound like you have faith in me, boss. Don't push it, Tawan replied, though the faintest smile tugged at his lips. The operation began at dusk, and everything unfolded as planned, at first. The widow's forces fell for the decoy, their focus drawn to the false convoy. Tawan, leading the main strike team, worked swiftly to dismantle her critical supply hubs. But as the night wore on, cracks began to show. The widow's forces responded faster than anticipated, and soon, both teams found themselves fighting off waves of reinforcements. Tawan's team managed to secure their objective, but the radio silence from Day's team gnawed at him. As the dust settled, he made a decision that left Rian fuming. You can't just leave the operation to check on him. Rian snapped as Tawan prepared to depart. We need you here. Day's out there because of me, Tawan shot back. I'm not leaving him behind. Tawan found Day's team in the thick of a firefight. The decoy had worked too well. The widow herself had shown up, leading a relentless assault. Tawan's arrival turned the tide, his men providing the backup Day's team desperately needed. Together, they forced the widow's forces to retreat, though not without losses. As the chaos subsided, Tawan found Day leaning against a crate, a gash on his temple and blood staining his jacket. You always this reckless? Tawan asked, crouching beside him. Day gave a weak laugh. Only when the stakes are worth it. Tawan shook his head, his anger and relief warring within him. You're lucky I came when I did. Day looked at him, his gaze unusually soft. Maybe I knew you would. Tawan hesitated, caught off guard by the raw honesty in Day's voice. For a moment, the battle, the widow, everything else faded away. All Tawan could see was the man who had risked everything, not just for the mission but for him. Without thinking, he reached out, his hand brushing Day's cheek. You're impossible, you know that? Day's smirk faltered, replaced by something quieter, more vulnerable. Yeah. But you like that about me? Tawan's heart thudded in his chest. He didn't respond, not with words. Instead, he leaned closer, closing the space between them until their foreheads touched. It wasn't a kiss, not yet, but it was enough to convey what neither of them dared to say out loud. We should get out of here, Tawan murmured finally, his voice hoarse. Day nodded, his usual bravado returning. Lead the way, boss. As they regrouped with the rest of the team, Tawan couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental between them had shifted. Whatever lay ahead, war, betrayal, or even death, he knew one thing for certain. Day wasn't just an ally anymore. He was something far more dangerous. The safe house was quieter than usual after the firefight, a tense calm settling over the air. Tawan's men busied themselves patching up wounds and reviewing the operation's results, but the real victory had been survival. The widow was still out there, but they had struck a blow she wouldn't forget. Day sat at the edge of the common area, wrapping a bandage around his hand. His movements were deliberate, masking the exhaustion etched into his features. Tawan, standing by the doorway, watched him for a moment before crossing the room. You should have let one of the medics handle that, Tawan said, his tone softer than usual. Day glanced up, his lips curling into a faint smile. I've had worse. Besides, medics tend to ask too many questions. Tawan knelt beside him, taking the roll of bandages from his hand without waiting for permission. Stop being stubborn. Day raised an eyebrow but didn't protest, allowing Tawan to work in silence. The quiet was heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken words. As Tawan secured the bandage, his fingers lingered briefly against Day's skin. Why do you do that? Tawan asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Do what? Day replied, his voice low. Act like you don't care if you live or die. Tawan met his gaze, his dark eyes searching for answers. Day leaned back slightly, the question catching him off guard. Old habits. You learn to stop caring when you've been left for dead enough times. Tawan's expression hardened. You're not expendable here. I need you alive. The words were simple, but the intensity behind them made Day pause. He leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. You keep saying that. Why? Tawan hesitated, the vulnerability in Day's question cutting through his defenses. He opened his mouth to respond, but Rian's voice cut through the room, calling for him. Tawan, Rian said as he entered, his expression grim. We've intercepted a message from the widow. She's planning something big. Tawan stood, his demeanor shifting instantly. Details. She's gathering her forces on the outskirts of the city, Rian said. If we don't move quickly, she'll have the upper hand. Tawan nodded sharply. Call everyone in. We're ending this. Day rose to his feet, his smirk returning. Guess we don't get much downtime, huh? Tawan glanced at him, his lips twitching into the faintest smile. Not in this line of work. The plan was ambitious, a coordinated strike on the widow's stronghold. Every resource, every ounce of cunning would be required. As the teams prepared for the assault, Tawan found himself alone in his office, studying the blueprints of the widow's compound. The door creaked open, and Day stepped inside, closing it behind him. You're awfully quiet tonight, Day said, leaning against the doorframe. Just thinking, Tawan replied, not looking up. Day approached, his steps slow and deliberate. You're not just thinking about the plan, are you? Tawan finally looked up, his gaze meeting Day's. For a moment, the weight of his responsibilities slipped away, leaving only the man behind the title. This fight, it's not just about survival anymore. It's about revenge. Justice for what she's done to my family. Day tilted his head, his expression softening. And what happens after? When she's gone? Tawan hesitated. I don't know. Day stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Then maybe it's time you started thinking about what you want. For yourself. Tawan stared at him, the words hitting harder than they should have. Before he could respond, Day closed the distance between them, his hand brushing against Tawan's arm. The touch was brief but electric, a silent challenge. You can't always live for the Empire, Day said, his voice laced with a rare gentleness. Sometimes you have to live for yourself. Tawan's breath caught, the tension between them building to an almost unbearable level. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words refused to come. Day smiled faintly, stepping back. Think about it. I'll see you at the briefing. As the door closed behind him, Tawan leaned against the desk, his mind racing. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder if there was more to life than duty and tradition, and whether that more could include Day. The briefing room buzzed with tension as the team gathered. The widow's stronghold loomed large in everyone's minds, a fortress deep in the outskirts, heavily guarded, and the center of her power. Maps and schematics were spread across the table, each one marked with potential entry points and vulnerabilities. Tawan stood at the head of the room, his commanding presence drawing the attention of everyone present. This is our chance to finish this, he began, his voice steady and resolute. The widow has taken from us our resources, our people, and our trust. Tonight we take it all back. Day, leaning casually against the wall, watched Tawan intently. He could see the fire in the other man's eyes, the weight of leadership balanced with the undeniable passion for justice. It was a side of Tawan that made him not just a leader, but someone worth following. Rian stepped forward, his expression as serious as ever. The stronghold is heavily fortified, but we've identified weak points in their perimeter. Day's team will lead a covert infiltration to disable the external defenses. Once the perimeter is down, Tawan's group will strike at the heart. Day smirked, his confidence cutting through the tension. Sounds like a plan. Just make sure you're ready for the fireworks. Tawan's eyes met his briefly, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them before he addressed the room again. We move at midnight. Be prepared for anything. As the convoy moved through the city's outskirts, the quiet was oppressive. The vehicles rolled down dirt roads, headlights cutting through the thick darkness. Tawan sat in the lead vehicle, his mind racing through the details of the plan, but his thoughts kept drifting to Day. The way he spoke, the way he carried himself, it all lingered, like a melody that refused to fade. You're unusually quiet, Rian observed, breaking the silence. I'm focused, Tawan replied, though his tone lacked conviction. Rian studied him for a moment before nodding. Good. We'll need you sharp tonight. Behind them, in one of the trailing vehicles, Day glanced out the window at the passing trees. He could feel the weight of the night pressing down on him, but it wasn't fear, it was anticipation. He'd fought for survival before, but this time was different. This time, he was fighting for something more than himself. The operation began like clockwork. Day's team moved swiftly through the shadows, their movements precise and silent. They reached the external defenses, a network of cameras and tripwires, working with practiced efficiency to dismantle them. As they finished, Day radioed in. "Perimeters down. You're clear to move." "Good work," Tawan's voice came through, steady and calm. "Stay in position until we breach." Day acknowledged the order, but something about the silence in the compound felt off. His instincts prickled, and he signaled his team to hold. Then he heard it, a faint rustling in the trees above. "Ambush," he shouted, just as a barrage of gunfire erupted. Tawan's team, already en route to the stronghold, heard the chaos over the radio. "Day's under fire," Rian said, his tone urgent. Tawan's jaw tightened. "Change course. We're backing them up." As they arrived, the scene was chaos. Day's team was pinned down, outnumbered but holding their ground. Tawan's men joined the fray, the tide turning as the two groups worked together to push back the Widow's forces. In the midst of the battle, Tawan spotted Day, a gash across his cheek and his eyes blazing with determination. Without thinking, Tawan fought his way toward him, his focus narrowing until he reached Day's side. "You always find trouble," Tawan said, his voice laced with frustration and relief. Day grinned, even as he fired another shot. "You'd be bored without me." Tawan shook his head, unable to hide the hint of a smile. "Let's finish this." After what felt like hours, the Widow's forces retreated, leaving the compound eerily quiet. The two teams regrouped, battered but victorious. As the adrenaline began to fade, Tawan turned to Day, his expression softer than before. "You okay?" Day shrugged, wiping blood from his cheek. "I've been worse." Tawan stepped closer, his voice low. "You scared me out there." Day's smirk faded, replaced by something raw and genuine. "I didn't think you scared easily." Tawan hesitated, then placed a hand on Day's shoulder. "Not for myself." The weight of his words hung between them, the world around them seeming to fall away. For a moment, neither spoke, their eyes locked in a silent understanding. Day finally broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've got a dangerous way of showing you care." Tawan's lips twitched into a faint smile. "You're not making it easy." Day chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I'm not supposed to." As the team prepared to move out, the unspoken connection between them remained, stronger than ever. In the shadows of the battlefield, something fragile and new had taken root, a flicker of hope in a world ruled by chaos. The convoy moved back toward the city, carrying the survivors of the ambush and the spoils of their victory. The Widow's forces had been weakened, her operation disrupted, but everyone knew the fight wasn't over. Inside the lead vehicle, Tawan sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the rain-speckled window. Beside him, Rian reviewed the damage reports. "We lost 3 men tonight. 5 injured. Could have been worse." Tawan nodded absently, but his thoughts were elsewhere. His mind replayed the moment he'd reached Day in the heat of the firefight, the raw relief that had gripped him, the unspoken connection that lingered even now. "You're distracted," Rian said without looking up. "I'm fine," Tawan replied curtly. Rian raised an eyebrow but chose not to press further. In the following vehicle, Day leaned back in his seat, his injured hand resting on his thigh. One of Tawan's medics had insisted on stitching up the gash on his cheek, but the sting of the antiseptic was nothing compared to the turmoil in his chest. He'd seen Tawan's face during the battle, the worry, the determination, and it unsettled him. People didn't look at him like that. As the convoy approached the city outskirts, Day's radio crackled to life. Tawan's voice came through, calm and direct. "Day, meet me in my office when we get back." "Alone." Day's pulse quickened. "Copy that," he replied, keeping his voice steady. Rian glanced at Tawan when the call ended. "What's this about?" "Strategy," Tawan said vaguely, though the weight in his voice betrayed something more. The safe house was quiet when they returned. Tawan dismissed his men, leaving only a skeleton crew to monitor the perimeter. Day made his way to the office, the faint hum of fluorescent lights accompanying his footsteps. When he entered, Tawan was standing by the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He turned as Day closed the door behind him. "You wanted to talk?" Day asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. Tawan set the glass down on his desk, his dark eyes locking onto Day's. You've been in this life long enough to know it's not just about survival. It's about trust. Day crossed his arms, his expression guarded. And you're not sure you can trust me? That's not it. Tawan stepped closer, the intensity in his gaze softening. I trust you more than I should, and that's the problem. Day's breath caught, the confession catching him off guard. Why is that a problem? Because it's dangerous, Tawan said quietly. For both of us. Day tilted his head, his smirk returning. You think too much. Tawan's lips twitched into a faint smile. And you don't think enough? For a moment, the tension in the room was unbearable. Then, without warning, Tawan closed the distance between them. His hand rested lightly on Day's arm, his touch tentative but firm. I've spent my whole life calculating every move, every decision, Tawan said, his voice barely above a whisper. But with you, I can't seem to think straight. Day's smirk faded, replaced by something raw and unguarded. He reached up, his fingers brushing against Tawan's. Maybe it's time you stop thinking. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Slowly, Tawan leaned in, his lips brushing against Day's in a kiss that was hesitant at first but deepened as the walls between them crumbled. When they finally pulled apart, both men were breathing hard, their foreheads resting against each other. This is a bad idea, Tawan murmured. Day chuckled softly. Probably. But when has that ever stopped us? Tawan smiled, the weight of his responsibilities momentarily forgotten. You're impossible. And you're stubborn, Day replied, his grin widening. Guess we'll make a good team. For the first time in years, Tawan allowed himself to feel something other than duty, something real and undeniable. The road ahead would be dangerous, but at least he wouldn't face it alone. The dawn crept over Bangkok, painting the city in hues of orange and pink. Tawan sat on the balcony of his penthouse, the cool morning breeze brushing against his skin. A fresh cup of tea sat untouched on the table, steam curling into the air. His thoughts were anything but calm. Last night's kiss had been unexpected, a fracture in the carefully constructed armor he wore. For years, he'd buried his own desires beneath layers of responsibility, loyalty, and survival. But Day had cracked the surface, exposing something Tawan hadn't realized he was missing. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Come in, he called. Rian stepped inside, his expression unreadable. We need to talk. Tawan gestured for him to sit, but Rian remained standing. The widow's retreat wasn't a surrender, Rian said bluntly. It was a setup. Tawan frowned, sitting up straighter. Explain. We've intercepted chatter. The widow's planning a counterattack, something big. Her people are already moving in the city. She wants to finish this? Tawan's jaw tightened. How soon? Hours, maybe less, Rian replied. We need to strike first. Tawan nodded, his mind already formulating a plan. Get the men ready. I'll be down shortly. Rian hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. You've been distracted lately. Is there something I should know? Tawan met his gaze, his expression cool. Focus on the widow. That's all that matters right now. Rian's lips pressed into a thin line, but he nodded and left the room. Tawan sighed, rubbing his temples. He had no illusions about Rian's suspicions. His consigliere was too perceptive to miss the shift in his behavior. But there was no time to dwell on it. Day was already in the training room when Tawan arrived, his movements fluid as he sparred with one of the men. The moment he saw Tawan, he dismissed his opponent and approached, a grin playing at the corners of his lips. Morning, boss, Day said, his tone teasing. Tawan ignored the warmth that spread through him at the sound of Day's voice. We have a situation. Day's grin faded, his expression sharpening. What kind of situation? The widow's planning a counterattack. We need to move before she does, Tawan explained, his voice steady. Day nodded, his eyes glinting with determination. What's the plan? Tawan outlined the strategy, their proximity as they reviewed the maps almost unbearable. Each time their hands brushed or their gazes met, the tension simmered just beneath the surface. As they finished, Day leaned closer, his voice low. You sure you're ready for this? Tawan's gaze flickered to Day's, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed to press down on him. But he nodded. I have to be. Day's lips curved into a faint smile. Good. Because I've got your back. Tawan's chest tightened, a mix of gratitude and something deeper swirling inside him. He placed a hand on Day's shoulder, his grip firm. And I have yours. The widow's forces struck faster than expected. As Tawan's convoy moved toward the stronghold, an explosion ripped through the lead vehicle, sending flames and debris into the air. Ambush! Rian shouted, drawing his weapon. The men scrambled for cover as bullets rained down from all sides. Tawan's heart pounded as he ducked behind a barricade, his mind racing. Day appeared at his side, his expression grim but calm. We're surrounded. Tawan cursed under his breath. We need to regroup and break through. Stay close. They fought their way through the chaos, the bond between them unspoken but undeniable. Every time Tawan faltered, Day was there, his presence steady and reassuring. As they reached a temporary safe zone, Day turned to Tawan, his voice urgent. This isn't just an ambush. She's trying to divide us, pick us off one by one. Tawan nodded, his jaw clenched. Then we end this now. With a renewed sense of purpose, they pushed forward, cutting through the widow's forces with precision. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the battle was over. Tawan's men stood victorious, though the cost had been high. In the aftermath, Tawan and Day found themselves alone in the ruined courtyard. The city lights flickered in the distance, a stark contrast to the destruction around them. You did good today, Tawan said quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Day chuckled softly. Don't sound so surprised. Tawan turned to him, his expression serious. I'm not. I don't know what I would have done if. Day stepped closer, cutting him off. Don't go there. We're both still standing. That's what matters. Tawan searched his eyes, the words he couldn't say hanging heavily between them. Finally, he let out a breath, his voice soft. Thank you. Day smirked, his usual cocky demeanor slipping for just a moment. Anytime, boss. As they stood there, the world quiet around them, Tawan realized that, for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep going. The widow's ambush marked a turning point. Although they had won the battle, the scars ran deep, resources were lost, loyal men killed, and morale shaken. Every move Tawan made from that night was under intense scrutiny. In the days that followed, Tawan's mansion transformed into a fortress. Armed guards patrolled the premises, and meetings stretched long into the night. Rian was relentless, pulling apart every detail of the ambush, desperate to find the traitor he was certain existed. Day was under constant observation. Wherever he went, eyes followed. Rian's distrust was palpable, a storm waiting to break. Despite the tension, Day moved with calculated ease, his demeanor unwavering. He spent most of his time analyzing Tawan's operation, suggesting new routes and contingency plans. His strategies were so effective that even Rian had to grudgingly admit their value. One evening, Tawan found Day in the training room. The mercenary was shirtless, sweat glistening on his lean, muscular frame as he moved through a series of combat drills. Tawan leaned against the doorway, watching in silence. You just going to stand there? Day asked without turning, his voice teasing. Maybe, Tawan replied, stepping inside. Impressive technique? Day paused, glancing over his shoulder. Flattery won't get you anywhere, boss. Good thing I'm not trying, Tawan retorted, grabbing a pair of sparring gloves. Show me what you've got. The ensuing match was intense. Day's movements were fluid and precise, while Tawan's strikes were powerful and controlled. They circled each other like predators, each testing the other's limits. When Day finally pinned Tawan against the mat, their faces were inches apart. The air between them crackled with tension. You're holding back, Day murmured. Maybe I didn't want to hurt you, Tawan replied, his voice low. Day smirked. I'm tougher than I look. They stayed like that for a moment longer before Day released him, offering a hand to pull him up. Tawan took it, his grip lingering. As they stood, Rian appeared in the doorway, his expression dark. We have a problem, he announced, breaking the moment. Rian's news was grim. The widow's forces had struck another blow, targeting one of Tawan's warehouses and leaving behind a chilling message: "Your empire will crumble." "She's not just targeting us anymore," Rian said during the emergency meeting. "She's trying to destabilize the entire city. If she succeeds, the police will crack down harder than ever and we'll lose everything." Tawan's jaw tightened. "Then we hit her first?" The plan was ambitious: infiltrate the widow's main base of operations, gather intel, and strike before she could launch her next attack. Day was instrumental in crafting the strategy. His familiarity with the widow's methods gave them an edge, though he avoided sharing too much about his history with her. That night, as they prepared for the mission, Tawan found Day on the balcony, staring at the city lights. "You've been quiet," Tawan said, joining him. "Just thinking," Day replied. "About her?" Day's lips twitched into a faint smile. "About what happens if this all goes wrong." Tawan placed a hand on Day's shoulder, his touch firm but reassuring. "It won't. Not as long as we have each other." Day turned to face him, his expression softening. "You're really bad at this comforting thing, you know that?" Tawan chuckled. "Maybe. But I mean it." For a moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of the coming battle heavy between them. The infiltration was a success, at first. Tawan, Day, and a small team managed to breach the widow's stronghold, navigating its maze-like corridors with precision. But as they approached her inner sanctum, the trap was sprung. Doors slammed shut, locking them inside a massive chamber. Gas hissed from hidden vents, and alarms blared. "She's always one step ahead," Rian muttered, covering his mouth and nose. Day scanned the room, his mind racing. "We need to find a way out." "No." The widow's voice crackled over the intercom. "Did you really think it would be this easy, Tawan? You've always been so predictable. Come out and face me." Tawan shouted, his voice echoing. The widow laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Soon. But not today. I have bigger plans for you." As the gas thickened, Day spotted a ventilation shaft in the corner. "There," he shouted, pulling a multi-tool from his belt. Working together, they pried the vent open and crawled through, emerging outside just as the stronghold exploded in a fiery blaze back at the safe house. The aftermath of the mission weighed heavily on everyone. Tawan was furious, not just at the widow, but at himself for underestimating her. "She knew we were coming," Rian said during the debriefing. "Someone tipped her off." All eyes turned to Day. "You think I betrayed you?" Day asked, his tone dangerously calm. Rian stepped closer. "I don't think, I know. You're the only one who could have given her that intel." "Enough." Tawan snapped, his voice cutting through the room. He turned to Rian. "Unless you have proof, this conversation is over." Rian stormed out, leaving Tawan and Day alone. "Why do you defend me?" Day asked after a long silence. "Because I trust you," Tawan replied simply. Day shook his head, a bitter smile on his lips. "You shouldn't." That night, Tawan found Day on the rooftop, flipping through a small notebook. When Tawan asked about it, Day hesitated before handing it over. The entries revealed everything: Day's connection to the widow, their shared past, and his ultimate goal: to kill her no matter the cost. "You should have told me," Tawan said, his voice tight with emotion. "I couldn't," Day replied. "Not until I knew I could trust you. And now?" Day's gaze softened. "Now you're the only one I trust." The weight of the confession hung between them, but before Tawan could respond, Rian burst onto the roof. "She's making her move," Rian said. "And it's not just you she's targeting, Tawan. It's the whole city." Tawan's grip tightened. "Then we end this. Tonight." As they prepared for the final confrontation, Tawan and Day found a quiet moment together. "If we don't make it out of this," Tawan began. "We will," Day interrupted, his hand brushing against Tawan's. "But just in case." He leaned in, their lips meeting in a kiss that was both desperate and tender. When they pulled apart, Day smirked. "You're stuck with me, boss." Tawan smiled, his resolve stronger than ever. "Then let's finish this." The night before the final confrontation with the widow was eerily quiet. The storm clouds that had lingered on the horizon finally rolled in, drenching Bangkok in a relentless downpour. Tawan sat in his private study, the faint glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. A glass of whiskey rested untouched by his hand, the amber liquid swirling as he absent-mindedly tilted it. He couldn't stop thinking about the rooftop, the kiss. Day's words echoed in his mind, "You're the only one I trust." It felt like a confession, not just of trust but of something deeper, something neither of them had dared to name. The soft creak of the door pulled him from his thoughts. Day entered, his usual confidence tempered by something quieter. He hesitated, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Tawan. "You're not sleeping," Day said, closing the door behind him. "Neither are you," Tawan countered, gesturing to the chair across from him. Day smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. He sat, leaning back with a casualness that seemed forced. Hard to sleep when the city's about to go up in flames? Tawan studied him, noting the tension in his posture, the faint shadows under his eyes. For all his bravado, Day was carrying his own weight of guilt and fear. "Why didn't you tell me about her sooner?" Tawan asked, his voice soft but probing. Day's jaw tightened. "Would you have believed me? Your right-hand man already thinks I'm a traitor. Rian's not the one you needed to convince." Day exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I wasn't sure you'd understand. The widow, she wasn't always like this. She was smart, ruthless, yes, but she had a code. When I worked for her, she was trying to survive, not destroy. Somewhere along the way, that changed. And you feel responsible?" Tawan said, more a statement than a question. Day didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost broken. "She trusted me. I left when she needed me most. Maybe if I'd stayed, she wouldn't have become this." The vulnerability in his words struck Tawan like a blow. He leaned forward, placing his glass on the table. "You can't carry the blame for her choices. People change, Day. Sometimes in ways we can't control." Day looked up, his eyes searching Tawan's face. "And what about you? Do you regret bringing me into this?" Tawan didn't hesitate. Not for a second. The sincerity in his voice left Day momentarily speechless. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're a strange man, Tawan. For someone born into power, you have more heart than most people I've met." Tawan chuckled, though there was little humor in it. "Heart doesn't keep an empire standing." "No," Day agreed, his gaze steady. "But it makes you worth fighting for." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Tawan felt his chest tighten, an ache he couldn't quite name. "Why did you kiss me?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Day's lips quirked into a small, almost shy smile. "Because I wanted to. Because I've wanted to for a while now." Tawan leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "You really are impossible. Is that a bad thing?" Day asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. Tawan didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood, walking to the window and staring out at the rain. Whatever this is between us, it's dangerous." "Everything about us is dangerous," Day said, standing and moving to join him. He was close now, so close Tawan could feel the warmth of his presence. "But you can't tell me it's not real." Tawan turned to face him, his heart pounding. For a moment, he let the walls around him crack, just enough to let Day see the man beneath the armor. "It's real," he admitted. "And that's what scares me." Day reached out, his hand brushing against Tawan's. "We're already in the fire, Tawan. Might as well burn together." Tawan's breath hitched at the words. He closed the distance between them, their foreheads touching. "You're going to be the death of me," he murmured. Day smiled, his voice a soft whisper. "Not if I can help it." They stayed like that for a long moment, the storm outside mirroring the tempest within. The next day dawned with an eerie stillness. The rain had stopped, leaving the city cloaked in mist. Preparations for the final confrontation with the widow were in full swing. Tawan and Day moved through the chaos side by side, their connection unspoken but undeniable. Rian kept his distance, though his eyes were sharp with suspicion. He cornered Tawan just before they were set to leave. "You're putting too much faith in him," Rian said, his voice low. "I trust him," Tawan replied firmly. Rian's expression darkened. "Trust won't save you if he turns on us." Tawan met his gaze, unflinching. "Then it's a risk I'm willing to take." The conversation ended there, but Rian's warning lingered in Tawan's mind as they headed out. The convoy moved through the streets of Bangkok, the tension palpable. As they approached the widow's hideout, a sprawling compound on the outskirts of the city, Tawan glanced at Day. "Are you ready for this?" he asked. Day smirked, though his eyes held a flicker of doubt. "I should be asking you that." Tawan reached over, gripping his shoulder. "Stay close to me." Day nodded, his smirk softening into something warmer. "Always." As the compound loomed ahead, the weight of what was to come pressed down on both of them. But for the first time in a long time, Tawan felt a spark of hope. Together, they would face whatever lay ahead, united not just by necessity, but by something far deeper. The air was thick with tension as Tawan and Day approached the widow's compound. The convoy had stopped just outside the main gate, a calculated decision to maintain the element of surprise. Rian barked orders to the men, his movements precise but tense. Tawan could sense his consigliere's unease, but there was no time to address it. "This is it," Tawan said, his voice low but steady. Day nodded, his sharp eyes scanning the perimeter. "She's expecting us. We won't get far without a fight." Tawan glanced at him, his jaw tightening. "We've faced worse." The compound was a fortress, its high walls topped with razor wire and patrolled by armed guards. Floodlights cut through the lingering mist, casting eerie shadows that danced across the wet ground. Tawan felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but beside him, Day was a steady presence, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this fight. As they moved toward the entrance, Day leaned closer. "Stick to the plan. I'll cover you if things go south." "You better," Tawan replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips despite the gravity of the situation. The first encounter. The widow's men were ready. As soon as the convoy breached the gates, gunfire erupted. Tawan's forces moved with precision, using the vehicles as cover as they returned fire. Day was a blur of motion, his combat skills honed to lethal efficiency. Tawan stayed close to him, his own gun steady in his hands. The chaos was overwhelming, but their movements were synchronized, a silent understanding guiding them through the battlefield. They pushed through the compound, clearing room after room. The widow's forces were relentless, but Tawan's determination burned brighter. He couldn't afford to fail, not now, not when everything he cared about was on the line. Face to face with the widow. At last, they reached the inner sanctum, a sprawling hall filled with ornate furniture and dimly lit by a massive chandelier. The widow was waiting for them, seated in a high-backed chair as if she were holding court. "Welcome, Tawan," she said, her voice smooth and cold. "I was wondering when you'd finally show up." Tawan stepped forward, his gun trained on her. "It's over, widow. Surrender now, and I might let you live." The widow laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the hall. "You've inherited your father's arrogance, I see. But you've made a mistake coming here." With a snap of her fingers, hidden doors slid open, and more of her men poured into the room. Tawan's forces were outnumbered, and the widow's confidence was palpable. Day stepped forward, his gaze locked on the widow. "I didn't think you'd go this far, Ploy." The widow's eyes narrowed. "Day, I should have known you'd betray me. You always did have a weakness for lost causes." "This isn't about betrayal," Day said, his voice calm but firm. "This is about stopping you before you burn everything to the ground." The widow rose from her chair, her movements graceful but menacing. "You can't stop me, Day. Neither of you can. But it's touching that you think you can." Tawan's voice cut through the tension. "We'll see about that." The battle within. The hall erupted into chaos as the widow's men attacked. Tawan and Day fought side by side, their movements seamless despite the odds. The widow watched from the shadows, her calculating gaze never leaving them. Day was relentless, his focus split between taking down their enemies and keeping Tawan safe. At one point, he caught a glimpse of the widow slipping through a side door. "She's making a run for it," Day shouted. Tawan nodded, motioning for him to follow. "Go. I'll cover you." "No," Day said firmly, grabbing his arm. "We do this together." Tawan hesitated, but the intensity in Day's eyes left no room for argument. The final confrontation. They found the widow in a hidden chamber, surrounded by her most loyal guards. The room was filled with weapons and documents, evidence of her vast network. Still playing the hero, Day? The widow sneered. You'll never win. Day didn't respond. Instead, he moved with deadly precision, taking down the guards one by one. Tawan joined him, their movements perfectly in sync. When the last guard fell, the widow stood alone, her confidence finally cracking. It's over, Tawan said, his voice cold. The widow's gaze flicked between them, her mind racing. You think you've won? You're just like your father, Tawan, ruthless, blind to the cost of power. Tawan stepped closer, his gun steady. Maybe, but I'm not him. And this ends now. The widow's defiance faltered, but she wasn't ready to surrender. She lunged for a hidden weapon, but Day was faster. He tackled her to the ground, pinning her in place. It's done, he said, his voice quiet but firm. The aftermath. The widow was taken into custody, her empire dismantled piece by piece. Tawan's forces emerged victorious, but the cost of the battle weighed heavily on everyone. Back at the safe house, Tawan and Day sat in silence, the adrenaline of the fight slowly wearing off. You saved me again, Tawan said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Day glanced at him, a faint smile on his lips. I told you, I'm not letting you go down alone. Tawan met his gaze, the unspoken connection between them stronger than ever. I don't deserve you, he admitted. Day reached out, his hand brushing against Tawan's. You don't get to decide that. I'm here because I want to be. For the first time in a long while, Tawan felt a glimmer of hope. Their world was dangerous, their futures uncertain, but together, they had a chance to build something real. And in that moment, beneath the shadows of their pasts, they found a light that refused to be extinguished. The first rays of sunlight crept through the curtains, casting soft golden hues across the room. Tawan sat at the edge of the bed, his head bowed, his hands clasped tightly together. The weight of everything, the fight with the widow, the lives lost, the empire he was struggling to hold together, pressed down on him like a crushing wave. Behind him, the sheets rustled, and he felt a warm hand on his shoulder. Day's touch was firm yet grounding, a silent reassurance that Tawan wasn't alone. You're thinking too much again, Day said softly, his voice rough with sleep. Tawan let out a quiet sigh. I can't help it. There's too much at stake, too many pieces to put back together. Day shifted, sitting up behind him. You always do this. Carry the world on your shoulders like you're the only one who can hold it up. You don't have to do it alone, Turning slightly, Tawan glanced over his shoulder at Day. The mercenary's dark hair was mussed from sleep, his eyes softer than usual, but there was still that same unyielding strength in his gaze. It was a look that had become Tawan's anchor in the storm. I don't know how to let go, Tawan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. It's all I've ever known. Control, power, responsibility. Letting someone in, it feels like a risk I can't afford. Day's lips quirked into a faint smile. You've already let me in, whether you like it or not. And I'm not going anywhere. Tawan's chest tightened, a mix of fear and longing swirling within him. Day leaned closer, his hands sliding down to rest over Tawan's, their fingers brushing. You trust me in battle, Day said, his voice steady. Trust me with this too. Whatever you're facing, we face it together. No more walls, no more pretending you don't need anyone. For a moment, Tawan said nothing, the vulnerability in Day's words cutting through his carefully constructed defenses. Finally, he nodded, his fingers curling slightly against Day's. Together, he murmured. The balcony scene. Later that day, Tawan and Day stood side by side on the balcony of the safe house, the city sprawling out beneath them. The chaos of the widow's attack seemed like a distant memory now, though its impact lingered in every tense breath Tawan took. Day leaned against the railing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. You know, when I first took this job, I didn't think it'd be anything more than another contract. Just another paycheck, another chance to keep moving. Tawan tilted his head, studying him. And now? Day turned to face him, his expression unguarded. Now it's different. You're different. I didn't expect to care about any of this, not the empire, not the people, and definitely not you. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and unpolished. Tawan's throat tightened, but he forced himself to meet Day's gaze. I didn't expect you either. But you're here, and you've done more for me than anyone else ever has. It scares me how much I need you. Day stepped closer, his presence a quiet reassurance. Then stop fighting it. Stop trying to push me away. Tawan's eyes flicked to the ground, the vulnerability threatening to overwhelm him. I'm not good at this, he admitted. Letting people in, being honest about what I feel, it's not who I am. Day reached out, cupping Tawan's cheek with a calloused hand. You don't have to be perfect. Just be real with me. The tenderness in Day's touch broke something in Tawan. Without thinking, he leaned into the warmth, his own hand coming up to rest against Day's wrist. I'm trying, he whispered. Day's thumb brushed over Tawan's cheekbone, a small but intimate gesture. That's all I need. The dance of shadows and light. Over the following days, Tawan and Day's bond deepened. They moved through the aftermath of the widow's downfall like two halves of the same whole, their strengths complementing each other in ways neither had expected. At night, when the world was quiet, they'd sit together in the dim light of Tawan's study, sharing stories of their pasts. Tawan spoke of the suffocating expectations placed on him by his family, while Day revealed glimpses of the lonely, dangerous life he'd lived before crossing paths with Tawan. You're the first person who's ever made me feel like I could stop running, Day confessed one night, his voice soft but steady. Tawan looked at him, his heart aching at the raw honesty in Day's words. And you're the first person who's made me feel like I don't have to carry everything alone. Their moments of quiet intimacy became a refuge from the chaos around them. In those stolen hours, Tawan allowed himself to be vulnerable, to let down the walls he'd spent a lifetime building. And Day, in turn, found a sense of belonging he hadn't realized he'd been searching for. The unspoken promise. One evening, as they stood on the rooftop watching the city lights flicker below, Tawan reached for Day's hand. The gesture was small, almost hesitant, but it spoke volumes. Day glanced down at their intertwined fingers, a faint smile playing on his lips. You're full of surprises, Tawan smirked, though there was a softness in his eyes that belied his usual stoicism. Don't get used to it. Day laughed, the sound warm and genuine. Too late for that. As they stood there, the night stretching out around them, Tawan realized something he'd been too afraid to acknowledge before. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just surviving, he was living. And it was because of Day. The road ahead was still uncertain, filled with dangers and challenges they couldn't yet see. But as Tawan tightened his grip on Day's hand, he knew one thing for sure. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Months had passed since the battle with the widow, and the world Tawan and Day had built together had only grown stronger. The empire was secure, the rivals subdued, and though the shadows of their pasts still lingered, they had learned to embrace the light that had emerged between them. The sun was setting over the city as Tawan stood on the balcony of their home, a place that had become their sanctuary. The hustle of Bangkok faded beneath the orange and pink skies, and for the first time in years, Tawan felt at peace. Day walked up behind him, slipping his arms around Tawan's waist. You look like you're finally letting go of all the weight. Tawan smiled, leaning back into Day's embrace. It's easier with you here. Day pressed a kiss to his neck, the tenderness of the moment sending a warm shiver through Tawan's body. We've come a long way, haven't we? Tawan nodded. From enemies to allies, and something more. Day's arms tightened around him, and they stood there for a long moment, savoring the quiet together. That night, they held a celebration at their mansion, not just for the fall of their enemies, but for the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. Friends and allies gathered in the grand hall, the scent of incense and flowers filling the air. Laughter echoed, and the sound of clinking glasses reverberated as people toasted to the future. Tawan and Day stood side by side, a united front. Their love, still unspoken in many ways, but fully realized in actions, was no longer a secret. The underworld had begun to respect their bond, seeing not just two powerful men but a force that could not be torn apart. Rian, ever loyal, raised his glass in their direction. To Tawan and Day. May you always stand together. The room erupted in cheers, and Day, ever the rebel, leaned close to Tawan. I can't believe they're toasting to us. Tawan's lips curved into a grin. We've earned it. The future together. As the party died down, Tawan and Day slipped away from the festivities, retreating to the quiet of the garden. The moonlight bathed the space in a silvery glow, casting soft shadows on the walls. I've been thinking, Tawan began, his voice soft, about the future. About us. Day turned to face him, his expression curious. What about it? Tawan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. I want a life with you. Not just the empire. I want more than the violence and the bloodshed. I want peace. I want to build something for us, something that lasts. Day's eyes softened, a rare vulnerability showing in his gaze. I've never believed in a future that wasn't just about surviving. But with you, I think maybe I can believe in something more. Tawan reached for his hand, his fingers brushing against Day's with the same tenderness that had marked their growing connection. Let's build it together. A life where we don't have to be trapped by the shadows. A life where we can just be. Day's smile was slow but genuine. I'm Tawan. Always. And in that moment, the weight of their pasts, the mistakes, the pain, the endless battles, all of it seemed to fade away. What mattered now was the promise of the future. They were no longer two men bound by duty, by obligation, or by bloodshed. They were partners, equals, and above all, lovers. As the night sky stretched above them, they kissed beneath the stars, sealing their unspoken promise. They had fought hard for this moment, and now, they would fight for the happiness they had found in each other. Years passed, and the empire they had built together flourished, but Tawan and Day had come to learn that there was more to life than power. They traveled the world, experiencing everything they had once been too afraid to reach for. They spent quiet mornings together, shared smiles in the middle of their business deals, and always found their way back to each other at the end of the day. And through it all, their love only deepened, stronger than any obstacle, brighter than any shadow. In the end, they weren't just two powerful men who had conquered a criminal empire. They were two souls who had found their way out of the darkness and into the light. Tawan had learned to let go, to love without fear. Day had learned to stay, to build a life worth living. And together, they had forged a future not just of survival, but of joy, of laughter, and most importantly, of love. The shadows that had once loomed over their lives no longer held power. Because they had each other, and that was more than enough. And so they lived. Together. Forever.